Hi guys, in this video we are going to look at the options you have when you need to map incoming values to something else. So let me show you an example. So imagine you have this incoming email, and based on this email you need to find user ID of that person. So when I run the scenario, I obviously get the incoming email. I do something in the middle to retrieve the user ID based on that email, and then I can see that I am posting to Google, which doesn't make too much sense, but for our purposes is good enough. And here I am posting the user ID in a JSON. So when I open the module like this, we can see that the email was mapped to user ID number 2. So now the question is, how many options or what can you do to solve these situations? And there are quite a few of them. So we will look closely at all the options you have. Let's start with the switch module, which I actually use for this example. So in this case, you can use the switch module to define your patterns and the outputs for each pattern whenever there is a match. So for example, for Paul Smith, the output or the user ID would be number 1. For Joe Doe, the user ID would be number 2. And for Pepe Lopez, the user ID would be number 3. Super simple. I assume all of you know this, but I just want to throw it out there that this option exists. Now, in the following samples, I'm not going to be doing the HTTP post or the subsequent action, but in the real life, once you do the mapping, there is always something following, some following action where you use that new mapped value. So let's now look at the second example. So in my second example, I'm going to be using switch inline function, not a module. I hope you guys know that this switch function exists. And the benefit of using the switch function is that you save one operation because you don't have to use a standalone module for that. The downside is that you have to know what you are doing. So you have to know the syntax and you have to be very diligent on what you enter at which position. So for example, here, I'm switching the incoming email based on these values to this, based on this value to this, based on this value to this, right? And if there is a no match, it will return not matched. So Paul Smith, again, will be user ID number 1. Joe Doe will be user ID number 2. Pepe Lopez will be user ID number 3. So now we can maybe change the incoming email to Paul Smith and see if this works, because previously we ran it for Joe Doe and the output was, of course, number 2. So let's run it for Paul Smith. And it's user ID number 1, which is correct. So far, so good. These first two options are super simple. There is no magic to it, but there is a little downside to them because the incoming values are basically switched to a different value. But it's kind of hard to associate multiple information in here, right? So for example, if you wanted to get more info about Paul Smith based on that email and maybe return not only just the user ID, but maybe also the city where the Paul Smith is living, it's kind of hard to do here. You will have to do some magic, which I will show you later, and it's just not very user-friendly. So now let's talk about situations where either the switch module or the switch functions are not enough. So let's say you have this incoming email now, and you not only want to get the user ID, but you also want to get the city where the user is living. So what you can do in this case is that you can use a helper JSON, for example, where you build your mapping like this. Just type it on your keyboard. And if you know how to build the JSONs, in the next step, you can simply use first map function to get the actual values. So of course, we will be getting the user ID, and then we will be also getting the city of the user. Right? So based on one value, based on the one incoming email, we are now going to be getting 2 values back. So let me run the scenario. And now we can see that the mapped user ID is number 1, and the map city for that user is New York. And of course, the user is Paul Smith. And when we check out our helper JSON, you can see that everything is matching perfectly. Maybe we can run the scenario for Pepe Lopez to demonstrate it does really work. So now Pepe Lopez is user ID number 3, and his city is Berlin. So far so good. And I would always recommend to have this mappings key as the first one, and then have an array of those mappings within that key. So when I open the modules output, we can see that there was one bundle. Within that bundle, there is mappings array, and within that array, we have those collections. So let's now talk about advantages and disadvantages of using this approach. So let's start with advantages. So obviously, based on one key, you can map multiple different values. So I'm just mapping user ID and city based on the email, but in the real world, you can have, telephone number, country, whatever you need. Another benefit is that this is easy to read if you follow the JSON syntax. So it's much easier to read this than read these inline functions. Another benefit is that you don't really need to use a data structure. You can literally throw your JSON into the parse JSON module, and that's it. Now let's talk about the downsides. So obviously the downside is that the mappings are just static based on how you set it before. So if there is a new key coming, then you will have to add a new mapping option by simply adding new collection like this, and of course changing the email and changing it to real values. Another downside, of course, is that you need to know how to write these JSONs, and it's very easy to make a mistake when you type it out. So I always recommend to run your JSONs through online validation tools. There are many of them, to make sure your JSONs are correct and there are no syntax issues. But overall, I use this approach a lot, especially when I know that my mappings are going to be static for a while, meaning that I will not have to touch these values for a very long time. This is for the trick with JSONs, and let's now move on to a different approach. Another technique which you can use are, of course, our data stores. So you can have a mapping data store with all those reference values, and then you can simply run a search based on the incoming key. Again, in our case, is the email, and then the data store will return the matched record with the values you are after, right? So for Pepe Lopez, we correctly got number 3, and the city was Berlin. I can also show you the data store. The data store is basically just following the same structure which I had in my JSON. The benefit of data stores is kind of obvious. It's very easy to read. You don't really have to mess around with JSONs too much. Data stores are also super fast to use if you have many values to match against. On the other hand, when you are setting up a data store, you are adding a dependency into your scenario. You also have to create a data structure, and you also have to make sure that your data store values are always updated. And when you want to check for the values, you kind of have to switch the screens between your scenarios, then go to the data store, etc. But as I said, the data stores are super fast. When there is a lot of reference values I need to go through, I would not do the mapping JSONs. I would go for data stores. And obviously, you can also update, delete, or create new records in the data stores from different scenarios, right? So in case your reference values are changing, you can automate those changes by creating new records, by updating existing ones, by deleting the records from the same scenario or maybe from different scenarios. So consider the data stores as one of the options to have when your reference values are changing a lot, and you got to make sure they are always updated. When it comes to the external tables, the concept is very similar to data stores, but instead of data stores, you are using a table which is sitting outside Make. So in my case, I went for Google Sheets. I can imagine also using Airtable or maybe fancier databases such as BigQuery or Snowflake. The concept here, again, is very similar to the data stores. So based on the incoming value, you look for that value within your table. Based on found matches, you can use those values in the subsequent modules in your scenario, right? So super simple. I just mapped the results here with no extra functions. Basically the same thing which I did here in case of data store. If you are wondering how my lookup table looks in Google Sheets spreadsheets, I assume you will not be that surprised that it's exactly the same as in the data store. Now, when it comes to benefits and disadvantages of this approach, the advantage is obvious. You can share this reference table even with people who don't have access to Make. If there are many manual changes to be done by non-makers, then it's very easy to share the spreadsheet or maybe share your Airtable base. And people can simply come in, enter the value, update them, delete them as they need, and your scenario will be always pulling from the most recent values. Now, the downsides of this solution is, again, you are adding extra dependency into your scenario. You are allowing a bit more of human factor. So there is higher risk of wrong values being entered. I also assume that you know that Google Sheets API is not always that stable, so you can't be getting 503s from time to time. But generally speaking, if you want to have a reference table outside Make where multiple people can come in easily and update those values or just check them out, Google Sheets is not that bad option. So again, let's run the scenario and make sure the mappings are working. So instead of running it for Pepe Lopez, which returned user ID 3 and the city of Berlin, we can run this for Paul Smith. And in this case, the return user ID should be number 1 and the city should be Berlin. Yep. So far so good. The return values also match with the spreadsheet and everything worked as expected. So let's now look at other options which you have. I would probably not recommend them to use that often, but sometimes it might be just a quick workaround which will allow you to get the job done quickly. So if you remember when we ran the switch inline function, we basically prepared our mappings like this, and I said, this is good, but it's kind of hard to return multiple different attributes for that email, right? So here we have just the user ID, but what if I also want to get the city? So you can get around it by introducing a delimiter and that other value into your output. So you can see here that for Paul Smith, I will be returning 1 pipe New York. For Joe Doe, I will be returning 2 pipe San Francisco. And for Pepe Lopez, I will be returning 3 pipe Berlin. And once I get the match, I simply set my variables again, and I split the mapped value by the pipe, and I get the first value, that would be the user ID, and then I get the second value, that would be the city. So by introducing a delimiter which doesn't appear within the values, you can chain the return information about that key. So let's say if I wanted to add the phone number, which would be on 3rd position, I would simply do this, and I would just get the 3rd item from that array, and it would be mapped phone number. When I run the scenario, I am getting the phone number for Paul Smith because the input was Paul Smith, and for Paul's case, we did have the phone number within the return string. So as I said, sometimes this little trick may help you. I probably don't recommend to use this too often because, again, it's kind of hard to read, especially if someone else comes after you and tries to debug the scenario. It may not always be so obvious, and I would rather recommend to go with one of these 3 options. And finally, one of the other options you have is also to simply use very long nested if functions. Again, those are hard to read, but they will allow you to get the job done if your list of references is just not that long. So already, if I open that module like this and I wanted to know what's going on here, I would probably have to do something like this to be able to read that formula. And so now I know that Paul Smith is user ID number 1, Joe Doe is user ID number 2, Pepe Lopez is number 3. And if there is a no match, the formula will return other. I could use the same trick to return multiple values with pipe delimiter or whatever delimiter you decide. So of course, I could chain the values like this. but we've seen that already in the previous example. So as I said, for ifs, you can do it, but make sure that there are no syntax errors. Make sure that you know what you are doing. Probably make sure that no one else is going to edit the scenario after you, because again, once you open the module, it's kind of hard to read. And again, one of the previous options, which are more standard, I would say, would be preferred. You can, for example, try an email which we have not tried before. So let me just break it so we get no match and see what the formula would return. So we got other here. You can also check the other modules. So no match here, no match here, no match here already because there is no match from the data store. Then we have no match here, no match here, and not match here. So all the options, all the techniques, they work as expected. It's on you what to use in your particular case. In my experience, I probably use either Google Sheets or data stores the most often. Then I use these helper JSONs, and then sometimes I use the switch functions. So I hope you have now more clarity on how to map incoming values or how to create references from incoming values to different values. I do understand that some of these techniques are well known to you, but I hope that you've learned at least 2 new tricks which you can deploy in your future scenarios. And that's it for this video.